And we'll talk to Republican Chairman Michael Whatley and veteran Democrat James Carville. We've all known for a long time that Joe Biden was in no physical condition to run for re-election. That's why the former president avoided the press like the plague. But a new book reveals that the level of outright deception was far greater than many of us suspected. It's by CNN anchor Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson of Axios.
The bottom line is the White House was lying, not only to the press, not only to the public, but they were lying to members of their own cabinet. They were lying to White House staffers. They were lying to Democratic members of Congress, to donors about how bad things had gotten.
But Biden didn't quit the race until that disastrous debate against Donald Trump. Now, Biden confidants were debating whether the president would need to use a wheelchair in a second term because of a degenerative spine, but that it would be political suicide to do it during the campaign, even as his own doctor said that could damage his health. Now, sure, FDR was in a wheelchair, but at that time, the press agreed not to show any photographs that would be unimaginable today. Kamala Harris advisor David Plouffe is so angry that he provided these on-the-record quotes. The campaign was an effing nightmare. Biden effed us. He totally effed us. The book, Original Sin, has unleashed a storm of criticism.
There's nothing worse than a journalist claiming to uncover something that was obvious to any adult with decent eyesight and decent hearing. Joe Biden's mental and physical condition was in sharp decline, and we all knew it.
Not only did Biden destroy his legacy by staying in the race, he ruined Kamala's too. So Democrats are leaking like crazy to Jake Tapper.
And I have to say, I find everybody now talking to these authors, get out of here. Go home. You're part of the problem. Now you tell us?
Tapper was asked about that point by his CNN colleague, John Berman.
Knowing then what I know now, I look back at my coverage during the Biden years, and I did cover some of these issues, but not enough. I look back on it with humility.
The 46th president triggered a new round of criticism when he appeared on The View.
What do you say to those critics?
I say, number one, that there were still 6 full months.
Wrong. It was just over 3 months. How do you make that mistake? Now, many Democrats are unhappy with the Biden's rehab tour, but Joe Biden, well, he still has his defenders.
All of these folks who are focused on, oh, Biden should go away. Well, how about the guy, and don't blame Biden for Donald Trump being reelected as president. Don't put that on Biden.
Don't put it on Joe Biden? Who else bears the main responsibility for the Democratic wipeout? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Mollie Hemingway, a Fox News contributor, and Megan Hayes, a top official in the Biden White House. Mollie, we thought we knew just about everything about the Biden cover-up. We could certainly see the decline on television, but there are some stunning revelations in this book, and what's made the most headlines is this debate about putting the guy in a wheelchair if he happened to win re-election.
Well, this is all part of a book operation where people in the media are saying, well, we didn't know that Biden was in a bad way. It was these people were lying to us, and they were keeping us from knowing this information. It really does not pass the smell test. You have more than 100 million Americans who, just looking with their own eyes, listening with their own ears, knew that Biden was in a bad way, actually, even before he ran for office in 2020. So this book launch where they're trying to say, oh, we have explosive details, it's not that explosive to most Americans because we all saw it. And by the way, when people noticed this, they were smeared, they were deplatformed, they were censored, in part by people like Jake Tapper, who mocked and derided people for noticing, and now he's actually trying to make a lot of money off of things that we all saw for many, many years.
Well, I don't agree that he mocked and derided them.
He did it to Laura Trump. He did it to Laura Trump when she talked about it. He said, you are mocking someone with a stutter. And he has yet to apologize to her for that. He also was working for a media outlet that mocked and derided everybody who noticed, who said that we were consuming deep fakes or producing deep fakes when we merely just showed videos of people of what Biden was like.
you heard him say that he looks back on humility and he should have done more. Megyn, you worked in a senior position in the Biden White House. Did you see signs of mental decline?
So I did not work there at the time of the coverage of this book. I had left long before that. But I will agree with you here, which I think people will be shocked about. The American people have made up their mind about Joe Biden. They made up their mind a long time ago about Joe Biden. There were going to be people who voted for him because they didn't want to vote for Trump when he was running for re-election. There were those people that were never Trump voters. And then there were people who were on the margins. But the fact of the matter is there's nothing really new news here. Everyone saw this. Everyone saw with their own eyes. The press covered him. The press were with him at every day, at every turn. He doesn't get to leave. He never got to leave the White House. It's the president, who regardless of party, does not get to leave without the press with them in tow. So the fact that we're saying that no one saw this, it's just blatantly not true. The American people saw, and whether or not the people around him were being honest about how deep it was or how severe people thought it was, the American people made up their mind. Donald Trump is now president, and the Democratic Party needs to move on from this.
Well, in fact, I've seen a lot of people questioned about this, and the Chuck Schumer and others. And it's like, well, we want to look forward. We don't want to look backwards. But looking backwards is what happened here. And, you know, in partial fairness to the White House press corps, they would take trips out of town with Biden and never see the guy. I mean, he was really sequestered. And we know now by that tiny inner circle that thought that this was a good idea for him to run again.
Well, so the claim made in this book is that it wasn't that the media were really bad at their job by not noticing what 100 million Americans noticed. They're saying, oh, we were lied to by an inner circle.
Mm-hmm.
If they were really going to hold themselves accountable for what they did, they might actually report news that matters now. That, you know, we're supposed to believe that this inner circle was lying about his condition. Well, then why did they have him debate in at such an early date, earlier than we've ever seen in modern presidential history?
It was
if
Biden's
they knew
idea.
he was so bad. Well, but why did they allow that to happen? And who moderated that debate? Jake Tapper of CNN. Isn't that interesting? Shouldn't we know more about why that debate happened? Were they trying to, what was going on here? I think really good reporting would name names about who was lying, what those lies were, and then also you would have accountability for the people who did it. We're talking about a man who single-handedly held the nuclear codes. This is a massively important situation that, again, the media covered up. They weren't duped. They were covering up and co-conspiring in a lie against the American people. That's a major story, and there's no accountability that we've seen from Jake Tapper or the rest of these people.
Well, Fox has now obtained the audio. We've seen the transcript of this interview that the then president did with special counsel Robert Hur. This was in the classified documents investigation, and I want to play a little bit of that for you.
1 month ago, dying, got maced. 2015 he died. 2015.
So this could go on. Biden didn't know when his own son had died, which year, and then he said that Trump got elected in 2017 when it was obviously 2016, and I don't think this is helping his case.
No, but I think that, again, the American people have the transcript to this, and I understand hearing the audio is different. But again, nothing here is new news. Also, the thing that the issue here about releasing this transcript is this politicizes it. The next president that comes in from either party can then release transcripts from Donald Trump's, and it also encourages people not to have recorded under investigation. So I think that we need to take a look at what we're doing here, and politicizing an audio transcript when we already had a written transcript, I'm not sure is necessary.
But you keep saying there's nothing new here, and that's, I think, a convenient posture, because you had, some people have even said, well, why didn't the cabinet invoke the 25th Amendment? To say there's nothing new here is to say that all of whether you like this book or not, whether you like Jake Tapper or not, that this book didn't have anything that we didn't know, and I don't think that that's true. I think it's a rhetorical device to say, well, let's move on.
The American people saw during the debate with their own eyes what was happening. So that's what I'm saying. So there's nothing new that the American people saw his aging, his physical aging and his mental aging with the debate. So there is no new information in my mind in the book. Having a doctor talk about if he took another fall, if he might have to use a wheelchair, I'm not sure that shows a mental decline. That shows a physical decline. So, I did not see anything that was not very obvious to the American people. Maybe they're spelling it out and giving more facts, but I don't think that this is anything that the American people didn't already know. I
would say that the physical and mental decline were intertwined. Molly, there seems to be a lot of anger among Democrats right now as Biden has emerged in what I call the rehab tour, going on The View, talking to the BBC, because it puts the spotlight right back on him today.
Well, it seems that the Democrats would like to say that the reason why they got wiped out in this last election was because of Joe Biden. They want him to embody all of the problems they had, when in fact he actually was always a pretty good vehicle for them. He portrayed himself as more moderate than he was, or than the way that he governed. And it was the policies that seemed to have made a lot of Americans feel alienated from the Democrat Party. And I think the sooner that they take responsibility for that, the better. But I just want to say about the Merrick Garland situation, the Robert Hur situation, yes. You might remember that Congress subpoenaed that audio tape from Merrick Garland. I believe Merrick Garland was one of the people Biden pardoned for his crimes against the country. But either way, there's a lot to learn there about why did Merrick Garland suppress that audio tape? Again, we're dealing not just with a candidate for 2024, which is what everyone seems so focused on. This was a man who was president until January of this year, holding nuclear codes. Anyone who was involved in suppressing information about the true state of his mental decline should absolutely be asked questions about that, be held to account. And until the media start moving things in that direction, where you're actually talking to the people who knew and what they did to cover this up, and how the media themselves were co-conspirators in that, there's no accountability being had. Well, if Biden was, first of all, I don't want to convict Merrick Garland of crimes, but if Biden had been candid about his condition, at least more candid, wouldn't he have had no chance of getting reelected? I mean, he wanted a second term. He didn't want to give up that job.
Absolutely, and I think he believed in his heart that he could win, and I think that is who he is to his core. I think he thought he could win.
He still says that.
And also,
which I don't get. I mean, Kamala Harris probably did better than he would have.
And we'll never know, right? So right. I think that you can't go again. That's his own choice, and he wanted to run, and that's what he did. But I think that President Biden took accountability on The View and said, we lost because of me. And Democrats do need to move on from this, and Democrats do need to figure out a way. And to your point, the Democrats did not lose because of Joe Biden. They lost because of the economy and the inflation that was going on, and American people did not feel like the Democratic Party was working for them.
I would add the border, which was a complete mess until an emergency was declared a few months before the election.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kayleigh McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.